Okay, free will. It's a hoary old chestnut. A lot of ink has been spilt over free will, and most of it disagrees with most of the rest of it. So another example of where you shouldn't believe everything you read, because if you try to believe everything you read, you have to believe everything and its opposite all at once. You get very confused and it all goes nowhere. All right. Exactly the same caveat as before. Don't take anything I say for granted. May not be true. Okay, this afternoon's session is going to consist of these parts. I'm going to talk about freedom and free will, and then we'll talk briefly about responsibility and ethos and morality, because I want you guys to talk about that. You know more about that than I do. So I want you to drive that. Okay, well, let's try and describe what we mean by freedom before we try and define it. Defining it is hard. Describing it, I think, is somewhat easier, because we do feel that we are free somehow. And we feel that we are free when these two conditions are satisfied. One of them is we feel that there's some choice available to us. The world presents us with choices. That's a property of the world. And we're free to choose them. So if we have no choice, if the world only presents us with one alternative, then choice just doesn't arise, or freedom doesn't arise, then you're just doing what you have to do. And the second one is that we, ourselves, the agent, the individual agent, we are able to actually exercise a choice. So there's something about us which makes it possible to exercise a choice, and there's a choice to be had. Okay, we need both of those before any kind of freedom can be felt. If you're the agent, are not at liberty to exercise it, then you're not free. And if you haven't got anything to choose, then you're not free either. So freedom needs something on both sides of you and the world to make it possible. And that's why we can say, if we have no real alternatives from which to choose from, there's no choice. And you don't feel free in that situation. And if you're not able or not at liberty to exercise a choice, then you're not free then either. So either one of those things is missing, and you're not free. Here's the example. If you're at the candy store, you feel that you're free to choose between the caramels and the licorice allsorts. And even if there's only caramels, you still have a choice. You can either buy some or not buy some. There's still a choice. There's always a choice. There's always an alternative. Sometimes you might like the alternative. You might say, oh, fuck it, I want to do licorice allsorts. Too bad, so you have no choice. But there's still a choice if you don't have the caramels or not. And so it was this kind of thinking that led Jean-Paul Sartre to suggest that there's always a choice, even if it's a Hobson's choice, even if it's a choice you don't want to make, even if you don't like it. I mean, it's either you hand over your money to the bushranger or he shoots you. Well, that's not much of a choice. It's still a choice, it's just not a very attractive one. And the answers are kind of obvious, but it's still a choice. Ultimately, there's still alternatives out there. So not only do we always have a choice, even if it's a choice we don't like, but we also always exercise a choice by choosing one of them. Good or bad, or worse, whichever one we choose. The best of a bad bunch, perhaps. And in this way, Sartre argued that we're fully in control of our lives. To the extent that the choices are available, we're always in control because we're always choosing an alternative. We either do something or we don't do it, or we do this or we do that. But there's always a choice. So he wanted to argue that we're free. And he said that as a result, we are condemned to be free. We don't have a choice but to be free. We must always exercise choices. We always have to choose, because even choosing not to choose is still a choice. You're still making a choice. So you can't escape choosing, according to Sartre. Now, what does that say about free will? Well, the question is, does free will exist? The answer depends on what you mean by free will. So the answer is sort of yes and no. And the philosophers don't agree among themselves about whether the answer is yes or no, because they don't agree on what free will is. So here's the thing. The question is, what is the will? And in what sense is it free? That's one question we have to answer. And the other question is Existence. What does it mean to exist? So when you ask the question, does free will exist? You first have to define what you mean by free will, then you have to define what you mean by existence. It's like that with philosophy, and you always have to define what you mean by these words. So what does it mean to say something is, to say free will exists? In what sense does it exist? These are questions we have to answer. I'd like to take a poll. All right, I'd like you all to play along. This is a little quick quiz. I'm going to ask you 10 questions. They're yes-no questions. They're very simple questions. There's no tricks. All I want you to do is answer yes or no to these 10 questions. Do one of these or 10 of these things exist? How many of these things exist? It should take you about 10 seconds to do this. So let's do it, okay? You can count them up on your fingers. Conveniently, you've got 10 of them. So let's do it, okay? Do you yourself exist? Count 1 for yes, or 0 for no, all right? Do you yourself exist? Okay, do apples exist? All right, good. Now, do electrons exist? Good, okay. Do rainbows exist? That's 4, right? Yep, okay. It should have a number down between 0 and 4. If you've got 5, you've got a problem. Does light exist? Okay. Now, does darkness exist? Okay, good. Now, does the number 0 exist? Okay. Triangles? Do triangles exist? Right, okay. Unicorns? Do unicorns exist? Okay. What about Santa Claus? There's no little children around, so it's okay. Your secret is safe with me. Does Santa Claus exist? Okay, now, you should have an answer between 0 and 10. Remember that answer, and I'll put the answer in the spreadsheet. Okay, there's the answer. Now, what do you notice? You don't all agree. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? You gave different answers. Okay, so you don't all agree. Fine. What else do you notice? There's no pattern. The answers are sort of random. Right? What else do you notice? Okay, who knows what a triangle is? You all know that, don't you? All right. Who knows what Santa Claus is? You all know that too. So you're not disagreeing about what these things were. You were disagreeing about whether they exist or not. That's the only place where the disagreement can be. It can't be that you're disagreeing over the meaning of apple or electron. You're disagreeing about whether or not these things exist. The reason is existence is not a simple concept. It's not a simple yes-no switch. Or if it is, it's not the same switch. I've studied this, and it turns out that the word existence actually has 8 different meanings. I won't go into what they are now, we haven't got time. You probably only use 2 of them most of the time, and you need to know the other 6 to work out what those 2 are. It gets a bit complicated. But you can see that there's an issue here with the meaning of the word existence. And there's no better way to illustrate it than this. Now, you'll be happy to know, there's no consensus, and the questions are all of the same form, but they're each asking something different. That's something else you would have noticed. When you asked, do unicorns exist, it wasn't the same kind of existence you were looking for than when you were asking about whether apples existed. It wasn't the same kind of question. Okay? Did you get that feeling that it wasn't quite the same kind of question? That's because existence is not the same thing in each of those questions. Okay. Interesting thing is everyone disagrees in the same way. Don't feel embarrassed about this. Here is the response from 250 of my students from University of Sydney. Now, they were all adults, and they all had university degrees. And look at the range of answers. Okay, there's a bit more of a bias towards the right. The group here is a bit too small, not enough to fill in all the blanks. But I've done it with a number of groups, and it's roughly that sort of pattern. Again, apart from the bias towards the high end, which is where Plato was, apart from the bias up there, there's basically a full spectrum of answers from 0 There was 20 questions in this quiz. The 10 questions I asked you were actually in that 20 questions. All I did was put 10 of them out to make it quicker. Okay? And guess what? Guess what the experts say? If you're Bishop George Berkeley in the early 18th century, you would have said yes to all 20 of these questions, or 10 of yours. So those of you who said 10 would be a Berkeleyan philosopher. If you said yes to between, 15, 17, if you said yes to 8 or 9, then you would have been a Platonist. Then you would agree with Plato. If you said yes to between, say, 6 or 7 in your quiz, you would have been a Humean. David Hume would have been, according to the literature, according to what he wrote, he would have said yes to about 6 or 7 of your questions. If you said yes to 3 or 4, which in fact very few of you did, if you said yes to 3 or 4, you'd be an Einsteinian, you'd be a physicalist, you'd be a natural realist, you'd be a scientist of some sort. If you said yes to only one of them in your quiz, which is you yourself existed and nothing else did, then you'd either be a solipsist or you'd be a Cartesian. You'd follow René Descartes. Here it's 2 because he had, in the 20 questions there was, do you yourself exist and do your thoughts exist? And both of those would comply with Descartes. And if you said yes to none of them, which is true if you did, who were the 2? Who said yes to none of them? 1 and 2. Well done. Excellent. That's my answer. Well done. Beautifully chosen. Then you'd be a Spinoza. Then you would follow the philosophy of Spinoza. None of those things exist. What exists is something else. There's none of these things. These things are just names for things that we observe, which are somehow the product of what there is. That was Spinoza's idea. There's some elementary substance which makes up, which exists, really, and then everything else is made up of those things. So that exists, everything else is just patterns. That's Spinoza. So, as you can see, the experts disagree for exactly the same reasons that you do. So don't feel bad about this. Existence is not a trivial subject. Okay, so, does free will exist? Well, it depends which one of these groups you sit in. That's why nobody agrees, because all the people in philosophy are talking straight past each other. They're not even talking about the same concept of existence, let alone the same concept of free will. How do you expect them all to come up with the same answer? This is why you can't believe anything philosophers say. You have to pick them apart and understand what they mean, and then make up your own mind, because you have to choose which definition you want to use, and then apply that to working out what you want things to be. Okay, so, as with freedom, of course, 2 conditions have to be met for you to have free will. There must be a choice, and you must have the ability to choose. If you have those, then you're free, that you have free will. There's freedom, and you have the free will. Okay? Now, number 1 is an external physical requirement. The environment has to give you the choice. And the second one is an internal physical or mental condition. So it's a property of the agent, of the person who has the free will or not. Okay? Now, as you might have read in Rachel's essay, we think of these 2 as 2 different freedoms. One is the freedom to act as you wish, which means the choice is there, the option is there for you to act. And the other one is to choose what you wish. Now, you might want to have the caramels, but did you choose to like caramels? Or did that just happen? I don't think you chose that. You chose to choose the caramels when you were in the shop. But what made you choose the caramels rather than the licorice also? It wasn't that you sat down and said, today I'm going to like caramels. What if you never like caramels in your life? That's just the way you are. Do you have that choice? So these 2 choices are 2 completely separate issues. Whether you have the freedom to choose what you wish, and then whether you get to enact and act as you wish. Choosing how you and what you're going to wish comes first, enacting it comes second. Now, physicists, scientists, perhaps some philosophers like me, some hard determinists, they reject both of these. They say, no, you're not at liberty to choose what you wish, you are what you are. You wish what you wish, you like what you like. you happen to like pink rather than blue. That's just the way you are. So you don't have that choice. And then he said, and then we say, well, if we don't have that choice, then we don't have the freedom to act as we wish, because we're compelled to act as we wish. And that wasn't chosen by us, that's just the way we are. On the other hand, the opposite end of the story are the libertarians who say, they assume both 1 and 2. They just say both 1 and 2 are possible. You can do both of those, so you're a free agent. And a compatibilist, someone who thinks that free will is compatible with determinism, will assume one and ignore the second one. So there are, again, different positions to take on what you think free will is, how much free will you want, and what kind of free will you want will make you either a determinist, a free willy, or an agent determinist, a compatibilist, where you're compatible with the world is determined, you are determined, but you still have a choice because you still get to do what you want. Why? Because you want it and you get to enact it. And that's good enough for free will, according to the compatibilists. So how you define free will, I think, is determined by which of these you subscribe to. And not all philosophers subscribe to the same thing. Okay, is that clear? Yeah? Okay, so free will is a problematic thing because not everyone talks about the same free will. And then when they ask does it exist, they're not talking about the same existence either. So what hope have you got? You're really on your own, mate. I mean, this is all there is. Okay, but here's a problem. There's a problem with all of this. If everything is free to act as it wishes, then how do you enact your wish? If I want to, say, go pick up an apple, if the apple doesn't want to be picked up, and it's free to do what it wants, then how do I get to pick it up? I have to impose my will and make it do my bidding, which means I'm free, but it isn't. It's got to do what I tell it. So if you want to have free will, you can only have free will if everything else has no free will. Because if everything else has free will, those things do what they want, and they're not going to obey you. And you're not going to be able to act out your free will. You can't get something to do something because it doesn't want to do it. If I want to lift my arm, and the arm doesn't want to go up, I haven't got the free will. I haven't got the will to raise the arm. I can't make it do it because it doesn't want to go. I might want it, but it doesn't want to go. It's free. It's got its own free will, and it's exercising its free will the same way as I'm trying to exercise my will over it. And you can't have something. So that's one of the tricks with free will. Everybody wants to have free will, and they want everything else to be unfree so they can exercise their free will. You can't exercise your free will beyond the limit to which other things will let you. Okay? And this was Schopenhauer, the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, where there is freedom, there's no will. Because if everything is free, you can't exercise your will. You can't get what you want done because it doesn't do it. And where there is will, there's no freedom. Notice that it's freedom by one party and will on the other, or will on one party and freedom on the other. It's not inside the one person that you have these tensions, it's between the person and the world. But this conflict exists. So now you have to resolve that and say, okay, well, how do I have free will if everything else has free will too? If you're a libertarian, you don't have any free will at all, because everything just does what it wants. So what sort of will do you have? How do you make sense of that? That's another challenge. I think that's an exercise in resolution. You have to resolve this conflict. Okay, so James Rachel argues for libertarian free will. Some of you may have read the essay. He argues for lots of things. He argues about free will and libertarianism and determinism. He puts in a passage, puts a paragraph in on each one. And his argument is this. And he says, any behaviour that is causally determined is predictable in principle. Okay? If it's determined to act that way, then you can predict that that's exactly what it's going to do, right? Now, not all human behaviour is predictable. We know that. Look around at people you know, they all act unpredictably, so there's no way it's predictable. So therefore, not all human behaviour is causally determined. That's a logical conclusion for the first two premises, right? Okay, so far. Good. And so, as a result, thinking of ourselves as free agents sort of inescapable. It has to be like that because we're not causally determined. If we're not causally determined, then we must be free agents. So we must have free will, right? That's the argument. Maybe. Is this argument sound? Who thinks this argument is correct? Be brave. Don't check it out. It's okay. You're allowed to think it's okay. Who thinks this argument is sound? Who thinks it's unsound? Okay. Why? Would you like to tell me why you think it's unsound?
Just because we can't predict human behaviour.
That's true. It doesn't mean it's not determined just because we can't predict it. Exactly. Yes. That's exactly right. Any advance on that?
I agree.
Same?
I was just going to say it's kind of bold to assume that humans don't comply to just like the causal workings of the world, like what makes us different.
That's an assumption, yeah. But this argument says, if those things hold, the conclusion is that we must have free will. I'm not asking you about whether it's true or not, I'm asking you if this argument is sound. Logically it is, yes.
I think that perhaps it's not, because just because something is not determined doesn't make it free. It's as if freedom is the opposite of determined is indeterminate, and indeterminate isn't necessarily chosen.
That's exactly, it's also random, that's right. It could be completely random, which will just, exactly, that's also true. That's another problem with it. But there's a bigger problem with this. And here's the video, here's the example, if I can make this go. This is a simple double pendulum. Okay, it's one piece of metal attached to another piece of metal, and it swings like an ordinary pendulum. You just let it go the way it goes. It's totally unpredictable. The pattern of behaviour, look, it spins, it does curly-whirly things. Every time you do it, every time you let it go, even if you let it go from exactly the same position, you let it go, every time it goes through this cycle, it behaves somehow differently. It is utterly unpredictable. And yet, at the same time, it's perfectly causally deterministic. It's pure Newtonian mechanics. There's nothing mysterious going on, it's all visible. It's just two pieces of metal obeying the law of gravity. Perfectly physical, deterministic, and yet unpredictable at the same time. So the very first premise that James came up with was incorrect. Just because something is perfectly causally determined, it does not mean that it's predictable in principle. In fact, most things are unpredictable in principle. They just have to be a little bit complicated. Simple things, if you had a simple pendulum, just a single one, single piece of metal swinging backwards and forwards, that would be perfectly predictable, sure. But you don't have to add much complexity to it in order to make it utterly unpredictable. So the important take-home message here is that totally, perfectly deterministic things can be utterly unpredictable. And the fact that something is unpredictable and perfectly deterministic at the same time is not a contradiction. That's a very important lesson to learn in life. That just because things are apparently unpredictable doesn't mean that there's no causal process behind it that makes it happen. All right? You don't need to have free will to do unpredictable things. The world, in a perfectly mechanical, causally entrained process, will do abundant amounts of unpredictable things all by itself. You don't need free will, and you can't demonstrate free will by claiming unpredictability. It doesn't get you there, because these things do it. Now, we can write down the mathematical equations. We can describe how it works. We can measure angles and distances and masses. We can do all that. And we can write down the mathematical equations for how the pendulum moves. It's not a simple equation. And the reason it's unpredictable, the reason it's chaotic, the reason why it behaves in such an unusual way is because it has feedback. Have a look at these equations. The first equation describes the movement of this angle up here. That's how that angle changes. And it changes depending on what the other angle is. That's theta 1 and that's theta 2. The second equation describes how theta 2 moves and is described in terms of theta 1. Whenever you have two equations, and it's non-linear because that's a sine of theta 2 and not just theta 2. It's a sine function. If you have a non-linear function with feedback like that, those two solutions, those two equations have no solution. In principle, we can prove. We know that it's not possible to solve those two equations, so don't try. Don't waste your time doing the maths. They can't be solved. And they can't be solved because that doesn't behave in any orderly fashion whatsoever. It behaves apparently randomly. Now, what this means, of course, is there's plenty of apparent randomness in the world. There's no real randomness. It could all be perfectly deterministic. It could all be perfectly mechanical, perfectly Newtonian. Quantum mechanics militates against it. That's another story. I won't go into that one today. But if the world is perfectly mechanical and it's complicated like that, then it will look perfectly random, it will look perfectly chaotic, it will look completely unpredictable, and yet it will be perfectly deterministic at the same time. So you can't tell, by observing something chaotic, you can't tell if it's determined or not. Because even if it is, it still looks chaotic. You don't get there. You can't get there from here. Okay. So, here's the position with free will. If the world is ontologically, actually, factually indeterminate, let's suppose there's no causal determinacy at all. Well then, it can't be predictable, so that's contradictory. And if it's unpredictable, well that means that you can imagine it being free will, but you can't prove it. Because it might not be. If the world is deterministic and is predictable, well then of course you can prove that there's no free will. But if the world is actually deterministic and you observe unpredictability, then free will is going to be an illusion. It's going to look like there's free will, but there won't be any. It'll just always look like it. And you won't be able to prove its absence. You can't prove its absence because even if it were absent, it would still look the same. So this is the quandary, this is the puzzle of free will. And you have to decide, in order to make up your own mind about what you think about free will is, you have to decide whether you think the world is physically deterministic or not. And then you have to decide whether you think the world is predictable or not. And then you end up in one of these four predicaments. And not all of you will be in the same predicament, because you can choose different options. So you can see how free will is problematic. You can see why philosophers have been arguing about it for 2,500 years. What I don't see is why they haven't worked this out in 2,500 years. It can't be that hard. But they haven't. Okay, so what can we say about free will? Well, how does it feel to us? At a minimum, I think we can say something like this. If we perceive, rightly or wrongly, doesn't matter, that in some situation we're presented with multiple real options, and we have more than one possible courses of action, this is all appears to be that so, then, okay, and we are aware, again, rightly or wrongly, doesn't matter, that we can in fact deliberate about this and make a decision and act out what we do, then it's probably reasonable to us to conclude that our act of choosing is or was freely taken. That's what we would be inclined to say. Rightly or wrongly, may not be. We might also say something like this. If we think or believe, again, rightly or wrongly, doesn't matter, that we are conscious and in full control of our senses. So we're with it, all right? We're in control. And if we are aware, again, rightly or wrongly, if we are aware of deliberating over some action and it seems to us like a good idea at the time, so we decide it's something we want to do, and we are aware of deliberating without undue external influence, so we're not told how to think, or we're not being forced to think in a particular away, we haven't been brainwashed or drugged or anything like that. If all that's true, then, and after we execute our chosen action, once we've done that, we're prepared to claim the action as our own, so we actually own our behaviour. Then we were also going to be inclined to say that our choice and our course of action was freely undertaken. So you think that was free. And we might even say something like this. Freedom is ultimately some kind of sensation or feeling. You feel that you have free will. It's an utterly subjective experience. And of course, if we feel or think ourselves free, then we must be free. Because that's all there is to it. If you feel you are free, then that's what freedom is. You cannot be more free than just feeling so. If I feel like I'm free, well, let me be as free as it gets. Okay? The first sign or symptom of unfreedom, of the absence of freedom, is not feeling that you are free. And this feeling must persist beyond the actions themselves. If after the event you cannot give to yourself an account of how and why you chose to act as you did, then it must be because you now feel that your action was not entirely free. So it must persist. You must think that it was a free act even after the act is complete. On any such interpretation, freedom is an attribution. It's not a property of the action, it's not a property of the world, but what you do is you feel that you want to attribute to the action that it was free. It's something you say about the action, but it's not necessarily a property that the action or the behaviour actually had. It's just what you want to say about it. You attribute freedom to it without it actually necessarily being so. Okay? It's a description. You ascribe freedom to an act. It's an attribution of all these things. You attribute to the world the presence of alternatives. You attribute to yourself the power to choose. You attribute the absence of interference. Nothing was stopping you from choosing. There was the absence of coercion. Nothing was forcing you to make the choice you did. And you exercise self-realisation. You're actually doing what you want. You feel like you're enacting your wishes instead of someone else's wishes. If you're a slave, for example, you wouldn't think yourself free because you're forced to do what somebody else wants rather than what you want. You have independence of agency and you have autonomy in thought and deed. You're on your own. Take away any one of these and you won't feel free. So you have to ascribe all of these to the world and yourself as an agent, and then you will feel that you're acting freely and you have free will. Having free will is just being able to act freely. There's nothing magic about free will, which is just not a manifestation of freedom. Free will is just the expression of freedom. Okay, so you need all those. Now, libertarian freedom of the underdetermined kind, of this kind which is not causally determined, which is not part of the physical world, I think is an illusion. We can show that physics is not a one-to-many physical system. There is no way that you can have something, a situation in the world which is one way, exactly one way, that has two possible outcomes. The laws of physics doesn't allow that. What the laws of physics say is if things are just so, the next thing that will happen will be just like so. All right? If I let go of this, it will fall to the ground. It won't fall up. It's an alternative, it's a choice, but it's not a physical choice. It's just not available. So I think that to imagine that what we call free will is itself a causal agent in the physical world. In other words, to have something which is free will, which is not itself caused by the world. It's free, but it is a causal agent, so it can act in the world and cause other things to happen. I think that's an illusion. Okay? That's to make a mistake. It's to mistake an attribution for a cause. Personally, I think Benedict Spinoza got it right, which is why I said no to all those yes, all those existing questions. I'm a bit of a fan of Spinoza. He was a very clever man, hundreds of years before his time. So he said, men believe themselves free simply because they are conscious of their actions and unconscious of the causes that make them act that way. That's where free will, it's that illusion of not knowing why I did something, so it must have been just me, it must be just freedom, because I don't know what else it could be. Okay, so where does that leave responsibility? We attribute different levels of responsibility. I can say you're responsible because you did it, without making any judgments about that. Or I can say that you did it and you also chose to do it. So I'm now attributing to you some kind of deliberation or determination that you wanted to do it. You didn't just do it. You might have fallen over and broken a glass, something or other. Or you might have deliberately intended to fall over and break something or other. That's a different sort of responsibility. Or you might choose to commit the act without regard to the consequences. You might have decided you wanted to take a dive and you didn't care about the past and you never thought of that. You didn't think of the consequences, you just wanted to do the act. So there's a different kind of responsibility again. Or you might have caused the act to occur but not actually done it yourself. You might have tripped somebody else to fall over instead of you falling over and breaking the glass vase or whatever it is. Okay? That's indirect causal responsibility as opposed to direct causal responsibility. Or you could have intended the consequences. The purpose might have been to break the vase. And the falling over was incidental, it was just one way to do it. And it might also be the case that you, the agent, knew that the act and its consequences were unacceptable to others, or you may not have known that. In each case, if you are judging this from the outside, you would attribute a different level or a different layer of responsibility, or you would attribute responsibility for different aspects of an action. So attributing responsibility is not a simple yes-no thing, not a simple direct thing. You've got to think about what it is that you are attributing responsibility for. So that's something we can unpick in the discussion later. We have to talk about what kind of responsibility you want to ascribe to people. And what kind of responsibility people are prepared to wear for themselves. There's going to be a difference here. You might think, I'm responsible for something in one way. I might think I'm responsible for it in another way. And we'd have a disagreement about that. Now, who knows? Am I right or are you right? Who's to say and whose word do you take? This is tricky. And that's where morals and ethics come in. I want to define morals and ethics rather carefully because I think they're two different things. Okay? And you won't read this very often. If you look up the Oxford English Dictionary, they define morals as ethics and ethics as morals. They think they're the same. I think they're different in this way. Every community and epoch has its ethos, its culture, its characteristic spirit. It's its ethos. I can't think of another word for it. Ethos is actually a Greek word meaning disposition or custom. That's what is customary in that environment. Okay, every society has that. And this ethos reflects what its citizens, on average, collectively like and dislike, fear, aspire to, regard positively or negatively, and so on, or regard as moral or immoral. All this stuff. Now, I mean collectively here, as statistically on average. I don't think they all think the same way. In every society, everyone thinks differently. But on average, the effect appears to be some kind of ethos, to which no one single person actually adheres. But the total, if you add them all up and divide by the number of people you started with and so on, comes up as being a bit like that. Okay? Now, morality then defines the kind of world we want to live in. That's the simplest definition I can come up with for what morality is. That's not ethics, that's morality. They are the values that you hold dear. Okay? You want to protect your individual rights and freedoms. You want to maintain social stability and cohesion. You want to operate in a world that appears to be somehow predictable and reliable and provides for your needs. So you want these things. This is the kind of world you want to live in. They are your moral principles. Now, the trouble is this two-way interaction between individuals and collectives. Notice that the first one is you want to protect individuals from the collective. The second one is you want to protect the collective from the excesses of the individual. This two-way interaction is complex in exactly the same way as that double-sided, that two-piece pendulum, just like a double pendulum. When you get that kind of feedback between the individual and the collective, you get chaos, you get complexity, you get mathematical complexity. And guess what? Complex systems are unstable, they're unpredictable, and they're uncontrollable or unmanageable in principle. So we've been at it for 10,000 years or maybe longer, we still don't have a perfect moral system. Why? There isn't one. It keeps changing, it's dynamic, morals change, values change, you change one thing, another thing changes in response, which you didn't expect, so that means you have to change it again, because it's different. It goes chaotic, and before you know it, you have a completely unpredictable system. It's why societies fail, it's why societies go to war, it's why some societies flourish for a while, and it all goes pear-shaped for a while, then it flourishes again for a while. It's just what it does. And no one's in control. You've got a government or something that says they take credit for all the good things and they blame other people for all the bad ones. But they're not in control. They're just talking about what's going on. All they do is describe what's happening. They're not directing this stuff. No one directs it. It's chaotic. It's complex. Society is just like that. Complex systems are like kaleidoscopes. All right? The changes are tightly governed by physical laws. Newton's laws of motion and gravity and so on. The emergent patterns are illusory. It's all done with mirrors in a kaleidoscope anyway. But in the real world, any pattern you see is just illusory. It just happens to be that way. And you might see a pattern even when the pattern is not there. Okay? Emergent patterns are pseudo-random. The patterns themselves are random. They're unpredictable. The evolution of the pattern is uncontrollable. You can't decide what pattern you want and then turn the kaleidoscope and make that particular pattern appear. It's not doable. You can't do it. Okay? The sequence of patterns never repeats. And it can be only changed by taking it apart and replacing the crystals, by changing the parts. The only way to change a society is to replace the people. We don't do that. Funny about that. And changes cannot be rewound or undone. Try this experiment hard. Get out your friendly kaleidoscope and find a little pretty picture and say, oh, isn't that nice? Then turn it ever so gently so the picture just changes a little. Minimum amount of change. Now try and change it back to get the previous picture. Can't be done. It'll go to the next picture where the initial conditions were like this instead of like that, and it'll go to it doesn't go back. No social system, no moral system has a rewind button. You can't change the tax system, for example, and say, oh, I know, we'll impose this new tax and that'll fix up the whatever it is about society, about the inequity of pensioners or whatever you do. We'll cancel negative gearing or whatever you do. You introduce some new tax. Or maybe you eliminate some tax. And the society changes. Let's imagine it changes in a way you didn't expect because you got the thing wrong. So say, oh no, what? We'll reverse that decision, we'll put the tax back in or take it back out, or whichever one you do the opposite of what you did before, the society will not go back to where it was. It'll take us somewhere else. There's no unwind, there's no redo. You can't go back and try again. There's only one way. Complex, chaotic systems like this only ever go forwards. You can change it to something else. You can't predict what it's going to be because it's complex. You might have some idea, but you'll be mostly right maybe. But you go forward, there's no backwards. And there's no stepping back. It's a one-way journey. And so it is with you. Every thought you have, every day you live, will affect you, will determine what your life will be like for the rest of your life. You may not know what effect it will have. Who's seen the movie Sliding Doors? Anyone? Oh, okay. Jeremy's seen it. Good. Oh, okay. Yeah, we're old enough to have seen it, right? It's been around for... Okay, I can thoroughly recommend it. It's a perfectly harmless movie. You'll all enjoy it. You'll find it somewhere on YouTube. It's called Sliding Doors. I don't remember the stars in it. It's got a couple of big names in it. It's a good movie. Sorry?
Gwyneth Paltrow, I think.
Oh, okay. Gwyneth Paltrow. Thank you. Good. Okay, so it's a great movie. Watch it. It's all about sliding doors. This guy goes down to a train and the doors close and he doesn't get on the train. And he has one life. And then the film replays, runs down, and he just manages to jump on before the door shuts. So he's now on the train. And the world is completely different, he has a completely different life. It all depends on that, whether he steps on that train or doesn't step on that train. Everything you do in your life is just like that. Except you can't predict what the future is going to be. But everything that you do today will affect your life for the rest of your life. It's just, and it's unpredictable, it's unexpected. It's what makes life interesting. Be prepared for it, accept it, it's just the way the world works. Okay, human societies are like kaleidoscopes. I mean, more so. They're even more complicated than that. And all these ideas, all these concepts, all these descriptions of what I describe as kaleidoscope apply to the real world. I mean, more so. It's even worse than that. It's even more unpredictable, and it's much bigger and much more chaotic. Okay, so now, that was morals. Morals describe the kind of world you want to live in. Ethics are different. Ethics stipulates how you want to go about creating the world you want to live in. Which is not the same thing as talking about what kind of world you want. Once you've decided what kind of world you want, you now have to work out how you're going to create it. And how you go about creating it is ethics. Okay? So that's the difference between morals and ethics. That's the distinction I want to draw. We do it by declaring laws, regulations, bills of rights, whatever you like. We do it by educating and socialising our citizens. You didn't know that, did you? You're coming to school to get socialised. We're going to make you like us, or like whatever we want, whatever we think you should become. We're here to train you to become the kind, because you're going to have experiences here at school, and you will be the product of those experiences. No surprise, this is not a secret. I think if you think about it for 5 minutes, you'll realise that's what you're doing. You're learning about the world, to learn to adapt to the world, to cope in the world, to live in the world, and hopefully to flourish in the world. The way you do that is by doing things like going to school. Sorry, there's no easy way to do this. You just have to go to school and learn it. We do it by enforcement and surveillance and security agencies and police and judiciary and military. We force people to do the things that we want to bring about the kind of world that we want to live in. And we do that through various mechanisms, and justice is one of them. You can see where this is going. And then we do it by prevention, detection and correction of unwelcome developments when things go pear-shaped. We try and fix it. There's different ways of fixing it, right? You can prevent it from happening. You can put a Band-Aid on it. Or you can actually replace the part before it happens. You do something. You can detect it, you can keep an eye out for it. As soon as it goes pear-shaped, you can jump in and stop it. Or you can correct it or repair it. Whatever you do, you fiddle with society. It's going to keep doing chaotic things. It'll keep doing unexpected things. You just have to be there to try and keep a fence around it and try and stop it from happening and keep it under somehow control and jump on it when it goes wrong. And that's what the justice system is. That's what we do. It doesn't mean we get it right. We'll never get it right because it's chaotic. Society is just complex. But we're going to try and somehow manage it and try and control it around the edges to see if we can contain it in some way. We don't always succeed. We've had civil wars. That's obviously a failed society. We have whole states that fail, whole countries fail. And they fail basically because people lose control of all the things that go on in that society. Every individual in that society is doing what they think is exactly the right thing to do for them. But collectively, the whole thing doesn't work, it all falls apart. Can't help that. It happens. Societies do fail. They also flourish. I'm not saying it's all bad. We're here, we've got a wonderfully flourishing society here in Sydney. I think we have a wonderful life in Australia. We're doing great. I wouldn't be in Somalia for quick, or Ethiopia. I wouldn't be there. Okay, so ethical practices are vastly complex and highly variable. The way we enact all this, the way we manage this complex thing is very complicated. There are lots of different ways of doing it, and it's hard to work out which one is the best one. Lots of value judgments come into it. But the fundamentals are not really that difficult to identify. There are only a few of them, and these are the principles that apply, that you apply to work out your ethical processes. Okay? The principle of least action. You can look these up. The principle of least action says that if something can happen, it will. And what's more, it'll happen as soon as it can with no delay, and it'll gazump anything else that could possibly happen because it'll happen first. Why? Because it can. That's a principle of least action. It's a principle actually in physics. Everything in physics is perfectly consistent with that principle of least action. In physics we call it Lagrangian because there's another fellow called Lagrange. He was shortly after Maupertuis. Everyone thinks the principle of least action was his, but in fact it wasn't. But physics is perfectly Lagrangian. There's no exceptions, which means the principle of least action holds absolutely in the physical world. We've never yet experienced an exception. The principle of equipoise goes back to Bourdieu in Paris in the 14th century. He says there's only ever one of those least actions. Think of a tug of war, all right? You're being pulled in two different directions. And think of how, if both teams are exactly equally powerful, and they're pulling with exactly equal force. Now there's two options, right? This team could win, or that team could win. What happens? No, what happens?
One of the teams will probably give up some of their force.
That's right. Until they do that, nothing happens. They're both pulling exactly equally, so nothing happens. So if you've got two least actions, neither of them can happen because each one stops the other one. That's equipoise. You're equally poised to go in two different ways. And you can't go in two different ways. The world doesn't do that. So the principle of equipoise says not only are there least actions, but you can only ever have one of them, which means you don't have any choice. The world doesn't give you a choice. There's no alternatives. If the world is exactly like so, there's one least action that will emerge out of that state of affairs. Whichever happens to be the one least action that hasn't got a corresponding opposite action to stop it. If it has, some third thing will come along, like a fly will land on the nose of one of the people in the tug of war, and he'll let go of the rope and sort the fly away, and of course then the other team wins. Now, the least action was the fly landing on his nose. It wasn't in the description of the tug of war, but the way you describe the tug of war, nothing was going to happen. So something else has to happen first. And that is the least action. So there's only ever one least action. Okay, type 1 and type 2 thinking from Daniel Kahneman. There's gut reactions like instant responses where you just respond to the world and act. And then you stop to thinking about it and say, oh, Jesus, did I do that? That's type 2 thinking. It's a very interesting experiment. There's a whole book written about it. I can thoroughly recommend it. It's a very enjoyable book. Kahneman got a Nobel Prize for that book. That's how good it was. It's a whole lifetime of experiments where he describes how people think and how people behave unpredictably. What they do, they respond type 1 quickly because they have to respond to their circumstances, and almost invariably they will do something which is completely different to what they would have done had they stopped and thought about it. It's just human nature. We're all like that. You're like that, I'm like that. And even Kahneman, after he wrote the book, somebody asked him, he said, has this changed your life? He said, no, I'm still an idiot like I always was. It's not changeable. It's not, you can't fix it. We're all like that. We all have this problem. Okay, emergent complexities. Edward Lorenz in 1963 was the one who discovered complexity, this idea that a double pendulum isn't predictable. And he showed it with computers were invented in the 1950s or so, very basic computers, and he was trying to do weather forecasting, and he just proved that the weather was unpredictable. It's unforecastable. Now we have massive supercomputers, and we get it almost right for about 5 days, and after that, the pretty shit go pear-shaped. Okay, theory of evolution. Oh, the prisoner's dilemma. That's another interesting thing to look up. It's the idea of you make a deal with someone, and the punishment varies depending on how what the other person decides, and then you have this negotiation. It's very interesting. Theory of evolution from Darwin, it shows you how everything goes forwards but not backwards. Social organisation with Dunbar shows you how societies greater than 150 need a certain political structure to try and hold them together, and how often that fails. Then you've got in-group and out-group relations, and you have the tragedy of the commons. I can recommend, it's only a short essay, I can recommend looking up that essay as well. But if you get all these principles, and you can see how each of these rules apply to the world, I think, somewhat modestly, I think that there's nothing in ethics which is not covered by those principles. That's all there is. It's some combination of these problems, and they all describe what your issues are, and you try and negotiate your way through the world by applying these rules. Because they're the rules the world run by. Okay, justice. I won't say much about it because this is what we want to discuss. The principles of justice from John Rawls. He says the principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. The way to make something fair is for you to make a judgment that seems fair to you regardless of which side of the judgment you're on. Okay? If you have to be either on the giving end or the receiving end, it has to seem fair to you regardless of which side you're on. You're behind that veil of ignorance where you don't know which side you're on. You're going to come up with the fairest possible judgment. Doesn't mean it'll be fair, but it'll be as fair as you can make it. So that's one principle of justice, which I think is a useful one. What he says is society should be structured so that the greatest possible amount of liberty is given to its members, limited only by the notion that the liberty shall not infringe upon anyone else. The trouble is there are lots of conflicts where they do infringe on other people, and then it gets a bit difficult. And of course, Rawls and everybody else write volumes about this. Justice, in fact, is the expression or practice of fairness. That's the intent. Working out what's fair, don't ask. It's hard, because everyone thinks fairness is something different. That's as much an emotional judgment as it is a real physical one. Okay? The principle of justice says each person has the indefeasible claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties. This is all the rights we have. Don't forget, for every right you have, someone else has got an obligation to provide it. And that doesn't always follow. But, and here's the kicker, is justice ever done? All right? Here's the example. 2 panels of 4 Jewish Israeli judges. Okay, there's 8 judges in all. And they sit in a room, each panel sits in a room, and they get presented with the paperwork pertaining to some criminal who's locked up in jail. And they have to decide whether or not to grant parole. Do they let him out? Okay? There are 1,112 of these parole determinations in this research. What these guys did, what Danziger, Levada, and Pesso did, is they actually got their records of the court and just collected all the judgments and went through them and had a look. So this is all genuine historical data that they analysed. They took 1,112 of them over a period of about 50 days, 50 sitting days for these 2 panels. There were up to 35 cases per day that were handled by each panel. And there were 3 sessions per day. They did sat there morning, noon and night. Started at 10 o'clock in the morning and stopped at 5 o'clock in the afternoon or something. A real case. This actually happened in Israel, right? Okay. This was a plot of the judgments they made. This is the case number per day. So they did about 35 cases per day. This was first thing in the morning, and that was at the end of the afternoon. And this is the percentage of paroles that were granted. The pattern does not look random. And if you look a little closer, these were the first cases in each of the 3 sessions. The morning session, the middle session, and the afternoon session. So it seems, not seems, it's evident that the judges were more generous and they were happy to grant parole first thing in the day, there and there. And then fairly rapidly, as the cases came up one after the other, they started saying, no parole. Until it went right down to almost 0, when they granted parole to no one. It turns out these were meal breaks. Okay? Which means that if the judges were hungry, they were leaner, and they were keen to get out and have their lunch, and they didn't grant parole. They came back from lunch, they were asleep. They said, oh yeah, he's a nice guy, we'll let him out. So the judgment they made, the ethics they apply, the morality, their own personal morality, change depending on if you have an empty stomach or full stomach. Now, if morality is that variable, how can you ever have justice? How do you do justice in a world that operates like that? Okay? Now, this effect has been tested in a number of ways. You can test this effect yourself. Oh, hello, this is not mad. Sorry. This effect has been tested. You can do an experiment. You can get a group of school kids, like yourselves, and we give you a questionnaire about moral questions. Do you think this is better than that? Would you do this? Would you grant this person parole? Whatever you like, all right? And you fill it out and collect the results. Then we give you a maths test, a hard maths test. So for the next half hour, you've got to work out all these math problems, and we pressure you to work hard at it. And then after you've done that, we'll give you another moral test. Exactly the same questions, worded differently, so you don't know they're the same questions, but they're the same issues. And we measure your moral responses to the same questions after you've done the math test. Guess what? You get different results. Why? Your brain is tired the second time, and you'll come up with different moral judgments. So morality, your very own personal morality, moral as you think you are, varies from hour to hour depending on how asleep or awake or how tired you are. Morality is that flexible, it's that inconsistent. The question is, how do you exercise justice in a society where everyone from the justices all the way down to the lowest citizens, their morality varies from minute to minute? That's a challenge for justice. A challenge for all kinds of justice. And it's a question that I want to leave you with, and we can discuss that. I want to leave that as a question. So what do we do now? What do you do with that? Is the question I want to ask. And I'd like you to help me answer it.